The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine streets of Oak Grove, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched out before colonial-style homes. Officer James Miller adjusted his collar as he drove his patrol car through the neighborhood, his coffee getting cold in the cup holder beside him. It was supposed to be another routine Sunday morning patrol in one of the city's most expensive areas. The residents of Oak Grove were usually still asleep at this hour, enjoying their weekend rest behind their tall privacy fences and security systems. That's why the figure of an elderly black man in worn work clothes caught Miller's attention immediately. The man was walking slowly along the sidewalk, stopping every few steps to look intently at one of the largest houses on the street. Miller's hand tightened on the steering wheel. The department had received several reports of burglaries in upscale neighborhoods over the past month. He watched as the man paused again, this time pulling something from his pocket. Was that a notepad? The officer's suspicions grew stronger. Running his thumb over his wedding ring, a nervous habit he'd developed over his 15 years on the force, Miller thought about the commendation he'd received last month for stopping a break-in. The chief's words still rang in his ears. Always trust your instincts. Right now, his instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. The elderly man had stopped walking altogether now, squinting at the house's foundation and making notes. He was dressed in faded jeans and a well-worn plaid shirt, clothes that Miller associated with handymen and day laborers, not residents of this exclusive neighborhood. The man's silver hair caught the morning light as he crouched down, running his hand along the base of the wall with what looked like professional interest. Miller pulled his patrol car to the curb, his coffee forgotten. Through his windshield, he observed the man's methodical movements. There was something about the way the elderly gentleman carried himself, a dignity in his bearing despite his worn clothes, that made Miller hesitate for just a moment. But then he remembered the recent burglary reports, and his training kicked in. Better safe than sorry, he told himself. A neighborhood jogger slowed down nearby, watching the scene with poorly concealed interest. Miller could feel curious eyes peeking through nearby windows as he stepped out of his vehicle. The sound of his car door closing echoed off the large houses, breaking the morning silence. The elderly man didn't seem to notice the approaching officer at first, absorbed in whatever he was examining. He pulled a measuring tape from his pocket, further piquing Miller's suspicion. Who takes measurements of a house at this hour? The officer's hand instinctively moved to rest on his belt as he approached, his boots crunching on the perfectly maintained gravel path. The morning breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming magnolias, a stark contrast to the tension that was about to unfold. A bird called somewhere in the distance, and a neighbor's wind chimes tinkled softly, providing an eerily peaceful backdrop to what Miller was convinced would be anything but a peaceful encounter. Little did Officer Miller know, his next actions would not only change his life, but would become a powerful lesson about prejudice and presumption that would ripple far beyond the manicured lawns of Oak Grove. His certainty about what he was seeing, shaped by years of ingrained biases and assumptions, was about to be shaken to its very core. The elderly man finally looked up as Miller's shadow fell across him, his eyes showing neither surprise nor fear, but rather a weary recognition. It was a look that spoke of too many similar encounters over too many years. As their eyes met, neither man could have predicted how this moment would ultimately transform not just their lives, but their entire community's perspective on judgment and justice. Officer Miller cleared his throat, adopting the authoritative tone he perfected over years of service. "Sir, can you explain what you're doing here?" His voice carried across the quiet morning air, drawing more attention from the growing number of onlookers pretending to go about their morning routines. Walter Thompson straightened up slowly, his joints protesting the movement after crouching for so long. The measuring tape was still in his weathered hands, and his notepad filled with careful calculations peeked out from his shirt pocket. At 73, he'd spent decades commanding construction sites and overseeing major architectural projects. Now, even in retirement, his eye for structural detail hadn't dimmed. "Good morning, officer," Walter replied, his voice carrying the kind of patience that comes from a lifetime of navigating difficult situations. "I'm just checking the foundation," but before he could finish his explanation, Miller cut him off. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Miller demanded, stepping closer. His hand hadn't left his belt, and his stance remained rigid with suspicion. The morning sun caught his badge, sending sharp reflections across the manicured lawn. Walter's expression shifted slightly, not quite a frown, but a look of resigned understanding. He'd seen that same suspicious glare countless times over his 45-year career as an architectural engineer. Carefully, he reached for his back pocket, his movements deliberately slow and clear. "I have my ID right here, officer, but if you just let me explain," Walter began again, his voice steady despite the frustration building in his chest. The measuring tape slipped from his hand, landing softly on the grass. Miller's reaction was immediate and excessive. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked, taking an aggressive step forward. The sudden escalation drew audible gasps from the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered on their porches and driveways. A young woman in running clothes had stopped nearby, her morning jog forgotten as she pulled out her phone and began recording. The sound of chirping birds was now mixed with the murmur of concerned neighbors and the distant sound of another police siren growing closer. Miller had already called for backup. Walter's shoulders sagged slightly, but his dignity remained intact. He built skyscrapers, designed bridges, and managed teams of hundreds, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal on his own family's property. He thought about his daughter, about the proud day she'd married Dr. Bennett, about the countless Sunday dinners they'd shared in this very house. "Officer," Walter tried one more time, his voice carrying decades of earned respect, "if you just contact the homeowner." "Put your hands behind your back," Miller interrupted, pulling out his handcuffs. The metal clinked ominously in the morning air. The young woman recording moved closer, her phone steady as she captured every moment of the unfolding scene. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as Miller roughly grabbed Walter's wrists. The measuring tape lay forgotten on the ground, next to the notepad that had fallen from Walter's pocket. Pages of detailed structural calculations scattered across the perfectly maintained lawn, each one a testament to the expertise that Miller had so quickly dismissed. Mrs. Chen from next door had come outside to water her plants, but now stood frozen, watering can dripping forgotten at her feet. Her young son peeked out from behind her legs, his eyes wide with confusion at the scene unfolding before him. As Miller began reciting the Miranda rights, his voice carried the mechanical certainty of someone who believed they were doing their job correctly. But there was something in Walter's calm demeanor that had started to make him uneasy, a dignity that seemed at odds with his assumptions. The backup siren grew louder, its wail cutting through the peaceful Sunday morning like a knife. Walter stood perfectly still as the handcuffs clicked into place, his expression not one of fear or anger, but of profound disappointment. He'd lived through decades of civil rights progress, yet here he was, being arrested on his own family's property because someone couldn't believe a black man in work clothes belonged in this neighborhood. The young woman recording had tears in her eyes, but her phone remained steady. "This isn't right," she said loudly, her voice shaking with emotion. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Other neighbors began to murmur in agreement, the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing moment. Just then, the distinctive sound of a luxury car's engine could be heard approaching around the corner. Walter closed his eyes briefly, knowing what was about to unfold. The truth was about to come to light, but the damage to dignity, to trust, to community was already done. The handcuffs felt cold against his wrists, a physical reminder of how quickly prejudice could strip away a lifetime of accomplishments. The backup patrol car pulled up with its lights flashing, casting rhythmic blue pulses across the perfectly maintained flower beds. The morning had turned into an impromptu spectacle, with neighbors abandoning any pretense of discretion as they gathered on their lawns. The young woman's phone wasn't the only one recording now. Several others had joined in, their devices pointed at the scene unfolding before them. Walter stood quietly, his hands cuffed behind his back, while Officer Miller spoke with his newly arrived colleague. The second officer, a younger man with 3 years on the force, kept glancing uncertainly between Walter and the growing crowd. Something about this situation felt off to him, but he wasn't senior enough to question Miller's judgment. He was acting suspiciously around the property, Miller explained to his backup, just loud enough for the nearby witnesses to hear. Taking measurements, making notes, could be casing the house for a break-in. Mrs. Chen couldn't stay silent any longer. Still clutching her forgotten watering can, she stepped forward. "Officer, I've seen this gentleman here before. He visits on Sundays." But Miller waved her off, treating her words as irrelevant to his investigation. The scattered papers from Walter's notepad caught the morning breeze, and a few neighbors began carefully collecting them. One of them, a high school engineering teacher, paused as he looked at the detailed calculations and professional annotations. His eyes widened with recognition of the expert work in his hands. "Officer," Walter spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of 73 years of dignity. "My son-in-law owns this house. If you just let me call—" "You can make your calls from the station," Miller interrupted, reaching for Walter's arm to guide him toward the patrol car. The crowd's murmuring grew louder, more concerned. The young woman who'd first started recording stepped closer, making sure to capture every detail. "This is wrong," she called out, her voice trembling but determined. "He's trying to tell you something important." Other voices joined hers, a chorus of protest growing from the gathered neighbors. Even the backup officer shifted uncomfortably, sensing the community's collective disapproval. Walter's measuring tape still lay in the grass where it had fallen, glinting in the morning sun. Next to it, more of his engineering papers fluttered in the breeze, detailed drawings of foundation repairs, precise measurements, and professional observations that would have immediately validated his presence to anyone who'd taken the time to look. An elderly couple who'd lived in the neighborhood for 30 years watched from their porch, the wife wiping tears from her eyes. "We've seen him here almost every Sunday," she whispered to her husband. "He's always checking something on the house, always so careful about everything." The backup officer picked up one of the scattered papers, his eyes scanning the professional drawings. A flicker of doubt crossed his face as he looked at Miller, then back at Walter. But Miller was already opening the rear door of his patrol car, his movements mechanical, driven by assumptions he wasn't willing to question. The neighbors' phones kept recording as Walter was led toward the vehicle. His work boots left slight impressions in the dewy grass, the same grass he'd advised his son-in-law about when they'd restored the lawn after the recent foundation work. He glanced up at the house's grand windows, knowing his daughter might be watching this humiliation from inside. Just then, a child's voice piped up from the crowd. "But Mummy, that's Dr. Bennett's dad. He helped me with my science project about buildings." The young boy's innocent observation cut through the tension like a knife, causing Miller to pause for a split second. But instead of reconsidering, he seemed to stiffen, as if the possibility that he might be wrong only made him more determined to proceed. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows across the scene. The backup officer's radio crackled with routine updates from other parts of the city, the normal Sunday morning calls continuing as if this moment of injustice wasn't unfolding in the heart of Oak Grove. Walter stood tall despite the circumstances, his professional dignity intact even as he was about to be placed in the back of a patrol car. He'd spent his career breaking barriers in architecture and engineering, but here he was, being judged not by his expertise or character, but by assumptions about who belonged in this neighborhood and who didn't. The young woman recording stepped even closer, her voice stronger now. "We're all witnessing this," she announced, making sure her words were clear in the recording, every single second of it. Other phones remained raised, their cameras capturing what was becoming a powerful testament to the prejudices that still lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly progressive community. Just as Miller placed his hand on Walter's shoulder to guide him into the car, the unmistakable sound of expensive tires on pavement cut through the tense atmosphere. His sleek, black luxury vehicle turned the corner, moving fast. The driver had clearly been alerted to the situation unfolding in front of his home. The black luxury car screeched to a halt in the driveway, leaving tire marks on the pristine concrete. Dr. Richard Bennett barely took time to put the car in park before jumping out, still wearing his surgical scrubs from the emergency operation he'd just completed. His face showed the exhaustion of a 12-hour surgery combined with the shock of the scene before him. "What in God's name is going on here?" His voice carried the authority of someone used to commanding operating rooms. The crowd parted instinctively as he rushed forward, his hospital ID badge still clipped to his scrubs, swinging with each urgent step. Officer Miller's hand froze on Walter's shoulder, the patrol car's back door still open. The backup officer took a step back, his eyes darting between Dr. Bennett and his colleague. The tension in the air shifted palpably as the truth began to dawn on everyone present. "Sir, this is a police matter," Miller started, trying to maintain his authoritative tone. "Please step back and—" That's my father-in-law you're arresting. Dr. Bennett's voice cracked with emotion. On my property. He ran his fingers through his hair, still wearing the surgical cap from the operating room. The neighbors' phones kept recording, capturing every moment of the unfolding revelation. Walter remained calm, standing straight despite the handcuffs. Richard, he said softly, I told them I was here to check the foundation work, but he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone present could fill in the blanks. Dr. Bennett's face shifted from shock to controlled anger as he approached Officer Miller. Remove those handcuffs, now. His voice was quiet but carried the same intensity he used when giving life or death instructions in the operating room. This man designed half the buildings downtown. He's been checking our foundation every Sunday for months. The gathered crowd murmured in confirmation. Mrs. Chen stepped forward again, still holding her watering can like a shield. We've all seen him here, officer. Every week, taking his measurements, making sure everything is safe. The backup officer moved first, reaching for his handcuff keys. Sir, he said to Miller, I think we should. But Miller stood frozen, his worldview visibly crumbling around him. The measuring tape still lay in the grass, alongside scattered papers filled with professional architectural drawings. How had he missed the obvious signs? The careful measurements, the professional demeanor, the calm assertions of belonging. Dr. Bennett pulled out his phone, quickly scrolling through photos. Look, he thrust the screen toward Miller. Here's Walter supervising the foundation repair last month. Here he is at my daughter's graduation. Here he is holding his architectural engineering awards. Would you like to see more? The young woman who'd been recording stepped closer, her phone steady. I hope you're getting all this on your body cam, officer. The internet's going to want to see how you handle what comes next. Walter spoke up again, his voice carrying no hint of anger, only a deep sadness. Officer Miller, I've spent 50 years dealing with assumptions like yours. I've designed buildings that changed skylines, but somehow I still have to prove I belong in front of my own family's home. Dr. Bennett placed a protective hand on his father-in-law's shoulder. I was in surgery, he explained to the crowd, his voice heavy with regret. 12 hours trying to save a child's life. And I come home to find this. He shook his head, surgical cap finally falling to the ground. The backup officer had moved to Walter's side, quietly unlocking the handcuffs. The metal clicked open, a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent crowd. Walter rubbed his wrists gently, his eyes meeting Miller's with a gaze that held decades of similar experiences. Mrs. Chen's young son broke the tension, running forward with one of Walter's dropped papers. Mr. Walter, I saved your drawing. The one showing how to fix the crack in the basement. His innocent intervention brought tears to several neighbors' eyes. Dr. Bennett knelt down to the boy's level, taking the paper with a gentle smile. Thank you, buddy. My father-in-law's drawings are very important. They keep all of us safe. He stood, turning back to Miller. Just like we hope our police officers do when they're doing their jobs correctly. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting harsh light on a scene that would change everyone involved. Miller's face had lost all its previous certainty, replaced by the dawning recognition of his own prejudices. The weight of his actions hung heavy in the air, along with the knowledge that dozens of phones had captured every moment. Dr. Bennett reached into his car and pulled out a thick folder, his hands still steady from years of surgical precision. Officer Miller, he said, spreading architectural drawings across the hood of the patrol car. These are my father-in-law's plans for our home renovation. Every Sunday, he checks the progress of the foundation work he designed. The morning breeze ruffled the papers, each one covered with precise measurements and professional annotations. Miller stared at the drawings, his face a mixture of embarrassment and dawning understanding. The backup officer picked up one of the blueprints, his eyes widening at the complexity of the engineering work. Your father-in-law designed this? The younger officer asked, genuine admiration in his voice. Designed it. Dr. Bennett let out a short laugh. Walter Thompson isn't just any architect. He's the mind behind the Children's Hospital downtown, the one with the earthquake-proof foundation. The same hospital where I just spent 12 hours saving a child's life. The gathered neighbors nodded in recognition. Mrs. Chen stepped forward again, this time more confidently. The hospital where my grandson was born, she added. The one they say can withstand any natural disaster because of its special design. Walter bent down to retrieve his measuring tape from the grass, his movements deliberate and dignified. "I spent my life making sure buildings keep people safe," he said quietly. 50 years of engineering experience, and still, someone sees an old black man in work clothes and assumes the worst. The young woman who'd been recording stepped closer to Officer Miller, her phone still raised. "Do you understand what you've done here? This isn't just about one mistake. This is about the assumptions that led to it." Dr. Bennett pulled out his phone again, scrolling through more photos. Here's Walter receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Institute of Architects. Here he is giving a guest lecture at the State University. Here he is breaking ground on the new City Hall. He paused, looking directly at Miller. "The same City Hall where you probably attended your police academy graduation." The backup officer had begun gathering Walter's scattered papers, handling them with newfound respect. "Sir," he said to Walter, "these designs are incredible. The stress calculations, the safety margins. I studied engineering before joining the force. This is master-level work." Miller's face had grown increasingly pale as the truth of his actions sank in. The neighbors' phones kept recording as he struggled to find words. "Mr. Thompson," he finally managed, I made assumptions that were wrong." Walter finished for him, his voice firm but not unkind. "Those assumptions could have ended very differently if my son-in-law hadn't arrived when he did. How many other professionals in work clothes have you prejudged? How many other lives have been disrupted because you couldn't see past your biases?" A gentle breeze stirred the papers on the patrol car's hood, drawing everyone's attention to the intricate designs. Mrs. Chen's young son pointed at one of the drawings. "Is that why our basement never floods anymore, Mr. Walter? Because you fixed it?" Walter's face softened as he looked at the boy. "That's right. Engineering isn't just about making buildings stand tall. It's about protecting the people inside them. Every measurement, every calculation, every Sunday inspection, it's all about keeping families safe." Dr. Bennett placed a protective arm around his father-in-law's shoulders. "The irony here," he said, addressing the still-recording crowd, "is that while I was performing surgery in the building he designed, the police were attempting to arrest him for caring about the safety of his own family's home." The morning sun now illuminated the scene fully, highlighting the stark contrast between the professional architectural drawings and the handcuffs that had been so hastily applied. The backup officer quietly returned to his patrol car, speaking into his radio with a tone that suggested higher-ranking officials would soon be involved. "Those papers you're holding," Walter said to Miller, who still clutched some of the scattered drawings, "show the reinforcement plans for the East Wing Foundation. I noticed some settling last week that could compromise the structure if left unchecked. That's why I was here so early, to measure any overnight changes before the Sunday traffic vibrations could affect the readings." The neighbors had drawn closer, many of them recognizing for the first time the level of expertise they'd had in their midst all along. The young woman lowered her phone slightly, but kept recording. "Officer Miller," she said, "I hope you understand that this moment isn't just about today. It's about every time someone like Mr. Thompson has had to prove they belong in spaces they helped build." Dr. Bennett gathered the drawings carefully, his surgical precision evident in how he handled each page. "My father-in-law has spent his career breaking barriers in architecture and engineering," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent gathering. "He's designed buildings that save lives, structures that protect communities. And yet, on a quiet Sunday morning, he still has to defend his right to exist in the spaces he helped create." By sunset that same day, the video had spread across social media like wildfire. The young woman's steady recording, along with footage from other neighbors, painted a clear picture of what had transpired in Oak Grove that morning. The police department's phone lines were flooded with calls, and local news vans had started appearing outside the precinct. Inside the police chief's office, Miller sat quietly as he watched the videos play on multiple screens. His badge and gun lay on the chief's desk, not taken but voluntarily placed there as he wrestled with the weight of his actions. The chief, a veteran of 30 years on the force, leaned back in her chair with a heavy sigh. "What do you see now, Miller?" she asked, pausing one of the videos. "What do you see that you missed this morning?" Miller stared at the frozen image of Walter Thompson checking the foundation, his professional focus evident even in a still frame. "I see." He paused, swallowing hard. I see everything I chose not to see earlier. I see a professional doing his job. I see my own prejudices clouding my judgment. The chief nodded slowly. The department will conduct a full investigation, but right now we have a bigger question to answer. How do we turn this into more than just another viral video? How do we make real change? Across town, Walter sat in his daughter's kitchen, surrounded by family. His daughter gripped his hand tightly, tears in her eyes as she looked at the raw marks the handcuffs had left on his wrists. Dr. Bennett paced the room, still in his surgical scrubs, fielding calls from reporters and community leaders. "Dad," his daughter said softly, "you don't have to be the one to fix this. You've carried this burden long enough." Walter looked out the window at the foundation he'd been checking that morning. "Sometimes," he said, his voice thoughtful, "the strongest structures are built on the places where we find cracks. Maybe this is an opportunity to build something new." The doorbell rang, and Mrs. Chen stood outside with a large pot of soup, her young son clutching a hand-drawn card. "Mr. Walter," the boy said, holding up his artwork, "I drew you checking the foundation. You're my hero because you keep us all safe." The local news was already running the story, but not just as another incident of racial profiling. They'd focused on Walter's distinguished career, showing images of the buildings he'd designed, interviewing people whose lives had been touched by his work. The children's hospital staff spoke about how his innovative design had saved lives during last year's earthquake. At the police academy across town, instructors were already downloading the footage, preparing to use it in their training sessions. But this time, they weren't just showing another example of what not to do. They were developing a new approach to community policing, one that challenged officers to question their own biases before making assumptions. The young woman who'd recorded the initial video found her inbox flooded with messages from across the country. Other professionals shared similar stories: architects, doctors, lawyers, all of them having faced the same prejudices while simply trying to do their jobs. Her video had sparked a conversation that was growing larger by the hour. Back at the precinct, Miller made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of defending his actions or trying to minimize what had happened, he asked to speak directly to community leaders. "I want to understand," he said to the chief. "I want to learn. And I want others to learn from my mistake." The backup officer, inspired by the day's events, pulled out his old engineering textbooks that evening. As he flipped through the pages, he found himself looking at building designs with new eyes, wondering how many other professionals he'd misjudged based on appearances. Walter's phone kept ringing with calls from civil rights organizations and community groups, all asking him to share his story. But he had a different idea. Taking out his drafting paper, the same kind he'd been using that morning, he began sketching a new design. This time, it wasn't for a building's foundation, but for a program that would bring police officers and community professionals together. Dr. Bennett watched his father-in-law work, recognizing the same focused expression he'd seen countless times before. "What are you designing now?" he asked. "A bridge," Walter replied, his pencil moving steadily across the paper. "Not the kind that spans rivers, but the kind that connects people. Sometimes the most important structural changes aren't in our buildings, but in our minds." Mrs. Chen organized a neighborhood meeting for that evening, and the turnout surprised everyone. People who'd lived next door to each other for years were finally having real conversations about race, assumptions, and community. The young boy who'd drawn Walter's picture proudly showed it to everyone, explaining in his innocent way how Mr. Walter made sure everyone's houses were safe. The police chief visited Walter's house personally that evening, not with cameras or press, but with a genuine desire to understand. She found him at his drafting table, surrounded by the very drawings that had been scattered across the lawn that morning. As they talked, a plan began to take shape, not just for sensitivity training or public apologies, but for real, structural change in how the department operated. 6 months after that fateful Sunday morning, the police academy auditorium was packed. Officers, community members, and local leaders filled every seat, their attention focused on the unlikely pair standing at the podium, Walter Thompson and Officer Miller. The morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the architectural drawings displayed on the wall behind them. "I've designed buildings all my life," Walter began, his voice carrying the same quiet authority it had that Sunday morning. "But the strongest foundation we can build is understanding. He gestured to the blueprints projected behind him, not of buildings, but of the new community policing program he'd helped design. Miller stepped forward, no longer wearing his uniform, but instead a simple suit. The past 6 months had changed him visibly, his face softer, his stance less rigid. 6 months ago, I made assumptions that could have had tragic consequences, he admitted to the crowd. I looked at a man's clothes instead of his character. I saw what I expected to see rather than what was actually there. The young woman who'd recorded the original video sat in the front row, her phone in her lap this time, not recording but listening. Beside her, Mrs. Chen and her son smiled encouragingly. The boy had brought his latest drawing, this time of Walter and Miller teaching together at the academy. This program isn't just about avoiding mistakes, Walter continued, pointing to the detailed plans. It's about building bridges. Every professional you see working in clothes covered in dirt, paint, or construction dust could be another Walter Thompson. Every person you meet has a story you can't read from their appearance. The backup officer from that day, now involved in implementing the new training program, stood up to share his perspective. As police officers, we're taught to trust our instincts, he said. But we need to understand the difference between instinct and prejudice. Mr. Thompson taught me that my engineering background could make me a better officer by learning to analyze situations thoroughly before jumping to conclusions. Dr. Bennett watched from the audience, still in his surgical scrubs after an early morning operation. The hospital he worked in, the one his father-in-law had designed, now hosted monthly meetings where professionals from all walks of life shared their experiences with local law enforcement. Miller clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from the program's first 6 months. We've seen a 40% decrease in unfounded stops, he reported. But more importantly, we've seen a 100% increase in community engagement. Officers are learning to see the people behind their assumptions. The chief of police stood up to share her own observations. When Walter Thompson first showed me his design for this program, I saw the same precision and care he puts into his architectural work. He didn't just want to point out what was wrong, he wanted to build something better. The young boy who'd drawn Walter's picture 6 months ago had started a trend. The academy walls were now covered with children's artwork showing police officers and community members working together. Each drawing represented a small change in how the next generation viewed authority and belonging. Walter moved to the next part of the presentation, revealing photographs from their community outreach events. There was Miller learning about construction from local contractors. There was the backup officer sharing his engineering knowledge with rookie cops. There were community professionals of all backgrounds teaching officers about their work and their lives. The foundation of any strong building starts below the surface, Walter explained, drawing on his decades of expertise. The same is true for community relationships. We'd have to dig deep, understand our biases, and build something that will last. Mrs. Chen stood up to share her story. 6 months ago, I was afraid to speak up, she admitted. Now my son wants to be both a police officer and an engineer, because Mr. Walter and Officer Miller showed him that understanding bridges all divides. The presentation concluded with a video montage, not of that Sunday morning's confrontation, but of the changes that had grown from it. Officers attending community events, professionals sharing their expertise, children learning about both law enforcement and various careers. The final image showed Walter and Miller standing together at a construction site, both wearing hard hats, both teaching a new generation about the importance of looking beyond first impressions. We can't change what happened that morning, Miller concluded, his voice thick with emotion. But we can change what happens next. Every day we have a choice, to build walls of assumption or bridges of understanding. Walter placed a supportive hand on Miller's shoulder, the same shoulder that had once held his handcuffs. The best designs, he said, smiling at the crowd, are the ones that bring people together. And the strongest foundations are built on lessons learned from our mistakes. The audience rose in a standing ovation, but the real triumph wasn't in the applause. It was in the conversations that followed, the connections being made, the assumptions being challenged. It was in the way officers now approached their daily patrols with new eyes, and in how community members felt more confident in their right to belong. As the crowd dispersed, the young boy ran up to Walter and Miller with his latest drawing. In crayon strokes full of childhood wisdom, he'd drawn a simple bridge connecting two sides of a divide. Above it, in wobbly letters, he'd written, "Building a Better Tomorrow." Walter carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his pocket, right next to his measuring tape, the same one that had fallen to the ground 6 months ago. Some measurements, he'd learned, weren't about buildings at all. They were about the distance we're willing to go to understand each other.